Tonight we follow a shadow that moves beneath the robes of power. An order sworn to serve the Pope, but rumored to answer to no one. Their loyalty was absolute. Their silence is unbreakable. They reach global. They were not kings or cardinals. They were confessors, spies, scholars, and sometimes something darker. For centuries, the Jesuits were trusted with the deepest secrets of the Vatican. But what if their true mission was never just education or faith? What if it was control? There are whispers of poisons without trace letters that vanish leaders who fell without warning. A silent army dressed in black, guarding not just the church, but a hidden agenda. And at the center stands the man they call the Black Pope, the Superior General. The one who does not speak to crowds, but commands from the shadows. So, before you look away, ask yourself this. If you wanted to rewrite the world and erase the truth, where would you begin? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we ask the forbidden question. Were the Jesuits the Vatican's hidden assassins? He was not born a saint. He was a soldier, a man of steel, pride, and battlefield scars. His name was Ignatius of Loyola, and before the world would call him holy, he chased glory with a sword in his hand and fire in his eyes. But all it took was one moment, one cannonball, and everything changed. It happened in 1521. Ignatius was fighting in a brutal siege when an explosion shattered his leg and his future. He was dragged off the field, broken in body, but something else had shattered too. As he lay bedridden in a dark castle room, he asked for his usual comfort tales of knights, battles, romances. But they brought him only one thing: religious texts, saints, martyrs, Christ. At first he resisted. Then he started reading, and something strange happened. He saw visions. Not dreams, not thoughts. Visions. Blinding, vivid. Voices, he claimed, were not of this world. Some said he went mad from the pain. Others believed something more was happening. He began to write down what he felt. A war was forming, not on the battlefield, but in his mind. Good and evil, pride and surrender. He spent days in silence, night crying, not out of pain but fear that he was no longer the same man. He claimed the Virgin Mary appeared to him. Those angels whispered a mission, one he would never speak aloud. But from that silence a new man rose. He left behind his armor. He walked barefoot across Spain, slept in caves, starved himself, flogged himself. He said the pain brought him closer to something real. He wandered for years and eventually arrived in Paris. There he met a small group of men, brilliant minds hungry for purpose, and slowly he gathered them. Not by force but by faith. He called them to a life of obedience, poverty, and a final vow. One vow that sets them apart from all others. Obedience to the Pope. Absolute. Immediate. No questioning. No delay. If Rome commanded, they would go anywhere to do anything. They would be priests, scholars, teachers, and spies. Whatever the church required. They were not monks. They were something new, something sharper. He named them the Society of Jesus. In 1540, Pope Paul III approved the order. And like a spark catching dry leaves, it spread fast. Within decades, they had schools across Europe, missions in Asia and the Americas, influence in royal courts, and a reputation that stirred both awe and fear. But what exactly had Ignatius seen in that dark room during his recovery? What voice had he heard? What vision had pushed him to create a group so loyal, so disciplined, so secretive, that centuries later they would be called the most powerful order in the Catholic Church? No one really knows. But one thing is certain. The vow they took in the shadows still echoes today. Quiet, absolute, and hidden just beneath the surface of history. Most religious orders take 3 vows: poverty, chastity, obedience. But the Jesuits had one more. 4th vow. A secret promise that set them apart from every other group inside the Catholic Church. A vow so powerful it made them the Pope's personal army, and sometimes his most dangerous weapon. This vow wasn't whispered in public. It was spoken in private, in Latin, behind thick stone walls. And it wasn't taken by just any Jesuit. Only the most trusted, the ones who had been tested, watched, trained for years. When the moment came, they swore absolute obedience to the Pope. Not just respect, not just loyalty, but this kind of obedience meant they would go anywhere and do anything at a moment's notice. No questions asked. Imagine that for a second. A man takes a vow to surrender his will completely. If the Pope told him to board a ship to China, he'd leave that night. If he was told to live in disguise in a foreign palace, he'd do it without hesitation. If he was told to influence a king, a queen, a council, a classroom, he would. This vow turned them into something different. Not just priests, not just missionaries, but instruments, tools of a higher command. And because of that vow, the Jesuits spread faster and further than anyone expected. They appeared in royal courts, offering advice. They opened schools that shaped the minds of future leaders. They served as confessors to kings, learning secrets no one else would hear. They navigated dangerous political landscapes and always seemed to land in positions of influence. Not because they demanded power, but because they were trained to get close and stay quiet. Over time, people started to notice. How were these men always where the decisions were being made? How did they rise so quickly? How did they know so much without ever seeming to ask? They didn't carry swords, but they didn't need to. Their weapon was trust. Their shield was secrecy, and their orders came straight from Rome. That's when the rumors began. Whispers in palaces and monasteries. Were the Jesuits just loyal servants? Or were they something more? Were they being used to control politics behind the scenes? Were they influencing kings through confession? Were they silencing threats before they reached the Vatican? The Church never said much, and the Jesuits didn't talk. That silence made people nervous. What did it mean to obey without question? What could happen when a vow became stronger than conscience? Some called them holy. Some called them heretics. Others feared they were the shadow arm of the Vatican, moving silently behind every major event in Europe. One thing was clear. No other vow in the Catholic world granted so much reach, so much authority, so much potential for control. And it all started with a sentence, spoken in Latin in a quiet room: to serve the Pope alone forever. They were called missionaries, men of faith traveling across the world to spread the gospel. But if you look closer at where they went and what they did, the picture starts to shift. Because Jesuit missions weren't just about saving souls. They were about gathering information, building influence, and sometimes doing things that looked more like espionage than religion. From the moment they set sail, Jesuits were trained to blend in. They learned languages with shocking speed. They studied local customs, wore native clothes, and lived among the people. In Japan, they dressed like scholars. In China, they studied astronomy and worked alongside emperors. In India, they taught philosophy and advised local rulers. On the surface, they came with crosses. But beneath the surface, they were listening and watching reports. Back in Europe, every Jesuit mission sent letters. Long, detailed reports sent straight to Rome. Not just about baptisms or conversions. These reports described geography, politics, trade routes, court secrets, even military strengths. Jesuits were mapping out entire empires under the cover of faith. And the Vatican was building one of the most advanced intelligence networks the world had ever seen. In China, Jesuit astronomers helped correct the imperial calendar. But they also learned how time and power were connected in that society. In South America, they converted tribes but also studied the land and its hidden resources. In Africa, they spoke of salvation while quietly learning about supply chains and gold routes. No matter where they went, they were gathering knowledge. And knowledge is power. Some kings welcomed them. Others feared them, because it was hard to know what the Jesuits really wanted. Salvation for the people or influence for Rome. Sometimes it looked like both. Other times it looked like something far more calculated. Even European monarchs began to worry. These men had access to too much. They knew the inner workings of foreign courts. They understood languages most diplomats couldn't even pronounce. And their loyalty wasn't to any crown. It was to the Pope that made them unpredictable and dangerous. And then there's the question no one could answer. What happened to the information they collected? How much did the Vatican know about the world because of the Jesuits? How many decisions were made in Europe based on what these so-called missionaries discovered in faraway lands? Maybe the Jesuits believed they were doing the work of God. Maybe they were just following orders. Or maybe they understood that to truly shape the world, you didn't need to rule it. You only needed to know how it worked. And they knew more than almost anyone. So were they holy men or hidden agents? That depends on which side of the story you believe. But one thing is certain. Wherever there was power, there was a Jesuit. And they rarely arrived by accident. They called themselves the Society of Jesus. But behind the name was something most people never saw. A structure so disciplined, so calculated, it didn't look like a religious order at all. It looked like an army, not of soldiers, but of minds. A silent army that didn't fight with swords. It fought with strategy. From the very beginning, Ignatius of Loyola didn't build the Jesuits like monks. He built them like commanders. Every member followed a strict chain of command. Orders came from the top, and they were expected to be carried out without hesitation. No debate, no delay, complete obedience. At the center was the superior general, a man known only by one name, the Black Pope. He wasn't elected by the world. He wasn't seen blessing crowds. But within Jesuit walls, his word was law. He could send men across the world. He could recall them in secret. His authority extended further than most kings. And yet almost no one outside the order even knew his face. Below him was a system that mirrored the ranks of a military. Provincials oversaw regions. Rectors ran colleges. Novice masters trained recruits. Everyone had a role. Everyone reported upward. And everything was written down. Letters, reports, evaluations. The Jesuits documented everything. Not for vanity, but for control. Even the process of becoming a Jesuit felt more like military training than spiritual formation. Years of testing, silence, psychological analysis, obedience, drills. Recruits were pushed to their limits, not just to prove their faith, but to prove their loyalty. Jesuits had to be mentally sharp, emotionally steady, and absolutely disciplined. The kind of discipline that could hold up under pressure or interrogation or temptation. They were trained to observe, to remember, to analyze. In meetings, they often said little. But when they did speak, people listened. Because Jesuits weren't just well-read. They were tactical. Their knowledge wasn't random. It was precise, focused, intentional. This wasn't an accident. It was the design. Ignatius himself was a former soldier. He understood the power of structure. He knew that chaos could be controlled if you had the right order. And the Jesuits became that order, moving through the world like shadows, always listening, always watching, never forgetting who they serve. Over time, other religious orders began to notice. So did governments. There was something different about these men. They didn't isolate themselves in monasteries. They embedded themselves in society. Universities, courts, scientific academies. Their presence was quiet, but their influence was deep. People started calling them many things. The Pope's elite, the Church's secret weapon, the invisible hand behind Catholic power. But the Jesuits never responded. They just kept moving one step ahead, always information. And that is what made them so powerful. Not just their minds, not just their mission, but their structure. A holy order built like an army without armor, without banners, without noise. Just silence, obedience, and strategy. The silent army of God. The Jesuits knew something most people didn't. If you want to control the future, you don't need armies or thrones. You need classrooms. That's why they didn't just build churches. They built schools. Dozens at first, then hundreds. And not just anywhere. In cities, in capitals, in places where power gathered. They called it education. But it was something more. A long game of influence. Their schools weren't like the others. They didn't just teach prayers or Latin. They taught science, math, history, astronomy, philosophy, even music and theater. Jesuit students didn't grow up poor and pious. They grew up sharp, confident, trained to speak well, think fast and lead. These weren't just students. They were future judges, generals, and governors. And they never forgot who gave them their education. Jesuit schools were free for the gifted and expensive for the elite. Either way, the result was the same. A generation shaped by Jesuit hands, their minds molded from a young age. Their ideas formed in classrooms filled with quiet rules and watchful eyes. Everything had a purpose. Every subject was chosen carefully. Every conversation is guided. They weren't just teaching facts. They were teaching a worldview. And because their schools produced excellence, people trusted them. Even kings sent their sons to Jesuit colleges. Even nobles begged for placement. Slowly, a quiet pattern emerged. The most powerful men in Europe had once sat in Jesuit classrooms. They had read Jesuit books, learned Jesuit logic. And that meant when they ruled with thoughts shaped years earlier by men in black robes. But not everyone saw this as holy work. Some called it indoctrination. Others called it manipulation. After all, how do you argue with a system that creates loyalty without force, that builds obedience through admiration? The Jesuits didn't have to threaten anyone. Their students wanted to impress them. That was the real genius. And it wasn't just about Catholicism. Jesuit education taught discipline, timing, strategy. Their alumni entered government, military science, and even rival churches. But they carried the Jesuit way of thinking with them. Quiet, calculated, purposeful. Some believed the Jesuits were building an empire of minds. Not with chains, but with chalk. Not with violence, but with verbs. Every lesson is a seed. Every essay is a tool. And in the end, when decisions were made and policies written, those seeds bloom. The Jesuits never denied it. They believed shaping minds was the highest form of service. But they also believed that the Church had to guide the world. And the best way to guide the world was to guide its leaders before they even knew who they'd become. So was it education or something else? Was it learning or loyalty? Maybe it was both. But one thing is clear. The pen wasn't just mightier than the sword. In Jesuit hands, it was the sword, and the classroom was the battlefield. A king might fear armies, but in the end he has to fear his own soul. That's where the Jesuits came in. Not with weapons, not with threats, but with silence, with listening. With secrets no one else was allowed to hear. Because in courtrooms filled with noise and power, there was one moment of honesty. One room where even a king had to tell the truth. The confessional. And more often than not, the man behind that curtain was a Jesuit. They didn't just arrive at royal courts by chance. They were invited, trusted, sometimes begged for. Because Jesuits weren't just priests. They were thinkers, advisors, problem solvers. They spoke multiple languages, understood law, science, and politics. Kings like that, queens too. And slowly, one by one, rulers across Europe chose Jesuits as their personal confessors. That meant access. Direct, unfiltered access to the minds of those in charge. In moments of doubt, in hours of weakness, in whispers after war or betrayal, the king would turn to his Jesuit confessor. And the Jesuit would listen, guide, advice, always calmly, always quietly. But here's the twist. Confession isn't just about forgiveness. It's about influence. When a ruler admits fear or guilt or hate the person who hears, it doesn't just know their sins. They know their weaknesses. And that kind of knowledge is power, especially when the one holding it serves the Pope. Some say the Jesuits used that power to shape decisions from the inside. That wars were ended or started because of a whispered suggestion. Those treaties were signed or broken after a single conversation. That queens turned against ministers and kings against brothers because of words said in private by a man in black. Of course, the Jesuits denied this. They claimed to serve only God. And maybe they did. But their presence in the courts always caused suspicion. Rivals hated them. Ministers feared them. Even popes sometimes wondered if they were too close to the thrones of Europe. Still they remained. Through regime changes, revolutions, assassinations, they stayed by the ears of kings. Not because they forced their way in, but because they were needed. They offered something rare. A voice that could not be bribed or threatened. A man who spoke with conviction but revealed nothing. Some kings kept diaries. Others wrote letters. But none of that compared to what they told their confessors. And only the Jesuits knew how deep those secrets went. So what happens when the most powerful rulers on earth are spiritually guided by men who take a vow of obedience to someone else? A vow that says they must follow the Pope before any king, before any nation. It means loyalty becomes a question. Influence becomes a weapon. and faith becomes a doorway. The Jesuits didn't need to sit on thrones. They only needed to sit close enough to whisper. And sometimes that whisper was louder than any crown. Not all power wears a crown. Some power walks in silence, waits in doorways, and listens while others speak. That was the Jesuits. Always present, but rarely center stage. They didn't rule nations, but they shaped the people who did. And over time, their influence began to show in the places that mattered most. War rooms, peace treaties, secret councils. The decisions that changed history often had a Jesuit shadow nearby. They knew how to get close. Confessors to kings, tutors to princes, advisors to queens. But they never looked like threats. They weren't generals. They didn't lead armies. They carried no weapons. Just knowledge, strategy, patience, and something most people overlooked access to. Imagine standing beside a ruler every day hearing their fears, their doubts, their anger. Over time, you understand what drives them. And if you understand someone deeply enough, you can guide their choices. You don't have to give orders. You just ask the right questions. Suggest the right idea. Drop the right word. That's how influence works, quietly. History is full of strange coincidences. Wars that began over misunderstandings. Alliances that formed out of nowhere. Treaties that seemed too perfect to be random. Behind many of them sat a Jesuit. Not signing the papers, but shaping the people who did. They weren't just working in one country. They were everywhere. France, Spain, Portugal, Austria, Poland. Even in lands considered hostile to Catholics, the Jesuits had agents. Sometimes as teachers, sometimes as scientists. Always as observers. Always connected. And they reported back. Letters coded and detailed were sent to Rome. Political shifts. Royal illnesses. Religious tensions. The Jesuit network became a kind of nervous system for the Vatican, able to feel changes across the continent before anyone else. That kind of information made them powerful and dangerous. Some accused them of playing both sides, advising one king while secretly supporting his enemy. Others claimed they fueled conflicts on purpose to push a hidden agenda. There were even whispers that some revolutions began only after Jesuit hands set the spark. Of course, none of this was ever proven, and the Jesuits never confessed to anything more than serving God and protecting the Church. But documents buried in archives and letters, once hidden in private vaults, suggest more. That sometimes the Society of Jesus did more than pray. They played the game of power, and they played it well, because if you want to shape the world, you don't need to lead it. You just need to guide the ones who do. Whisper in the right ear. Plant the right idea. Step back and let history follow. That is what made the Jesuits more than priests, more than scholars. They were the power behind the throne. And in many cases, the ones who helped build it. They moved like shadows, across cities and kingdoms, oceans and deserts, always in black robes, always calm, polite, educated. But underneath the surface, there was something else. A system, a structure, a secret web connecting them across continents. They called it their mission. Others called it a network, a hidden one, known only to the Society of Jesus, known only to the Jesuits. This was no ordinary travel plan. Jesuit agents had routes that didn't appear on maps, safe houses in cities where no one knew they were even present. Coded letters passed through merchant hands, passwords whispered in confessionals, symbols carved into wood or sewn into hymns. You couldn't see the network unless you knew what to look for. But it was there, alive, active, and always watching. Each major region had a provincial, like a general. He knew where every man under him was stationed, what language he spoke, what mission he had been assigned. Reports were written in layers of meaning. What looked like a prayer or a lesson often carried double messages, hidden updates, silent warnings. Every Jesuit was trained to write like this, to speak in one tone and think in another. Travelers who weren't part of the order had no idea they were crossing paths with agents. A scholar at a university, a priest in a mission town, a tutor in a royal palace. These weren't random placements. They were positions with purpose, each one part of a web of influence, observation, and communication. And the signals were simple but effective. A candle placed in a specific window at a specific time. Pattern of knocks. A phrase slipped into conversation that sounded like a quote from scripture, but meant something else entirely. These signals told other Jesuits when to meet, when to stay hidden, when to move. Even their clothing became a kind of message. The cut of a robe, the way a sash was tied to the ring on a finger. To outsiders it meant nothing. To another Jesuit it meant everything. Rank, role, readiness. They could blend into any society, speak like the locals, live like the locals, and yet carry out tasks assigned from thousands of miles away. Because the Jesuit mission wasn't tied to one place. It was global, and the network made that possible. Over time, governments began to suspect something. How did the Jesuits always seem to know what was happening? How did they respond so quickly to changes? How did they coordinate without being caught? Some countries tried to ban them. Others spied on them. But the network was too deep, too quiet, too well organized. It didn't rely on one man or one message. It was a living system, built on discipline, memory, and absolute trust. And that is what made it so powerful. A Jesuit could disappear from one city and appear in another halfway across the world, with new orders and a new identity. But the mission stayed the same. The Church must be protected, and the network must remain unseen. They didn't need force. They had information. They had movement, and they had each other. The Black Robe Network was real, and it was everywhere. The word Inquisition sends a chill through history. Torture chambers, heresy trials, fires that swallowed books and people. But behind the terrifying image was something even harder to see. The planning, the advice, the whispers in the background. And many believed the Jesuits were right there, not always in public, but guiding it all like a hidden hand. Officially, the Jesuits weren't the ones turning the wheel. That was left to others, the Dominicans, the bishops, the courts. But Jesuits were often nearby, watching, advising, taking confession, writing reports. Their job was to protect the faith, and that meant identifying threats, whether those threats came from false teachings from books, or from people who simply asked the wrong questions. Jesuits were trained to spot heresy before it bloomed. They were experts in doctrine, philosophy, and rhetoric. That made them valuable to inquisitors. If a scholar said something strange, it was often a Jesuit who explained whether it crossed the line. If a book was suspicious, a Jesuit might be asked to review it, not to destroy it, but to decide if it was too dangerous to exist. And sometimes that judgment meant silence, permanent silence. There are letters hidden in old Vatican files where Jesuits warned about professors teaching new ideas, scientists challenging church tradition, priests speaking too freely. These letters didn't order executions, but they often led to investigations, and investigations in those times rarely ended with mercy. Some say the Jesuits didn't need to light the fires themselves. They only needed to point a word to the right official, a suggestion to the right bishop, a gentle reminder that unity must be protected. Then the machinery moved forward, quietly, legally, but always with consequences. In some regions, Jesuits were seen as protectors, in others as spies. Students feared saying too much in their presence. Writers avoided subjects that might draw their attention. And critics of the church often vanished from public life after one too many conversations with a Jesuit advisor. Of course, the society denied any role in the harsher side of the Inquisition. They insisted they served truth and mercy. But when your network reaches every court, every school, every pulpit, it becomes hard to separate what you influence from what you control. Some historians believe the Jesuits kept lists, names of men and women whose beliefs strayed too far. Not enemies, but risks. And in times of crisis, those lists became targets. Not for war, but for removal. Quiet, orderly, and final. Maybe they believed they were saving the church from collapse. That one heretic could cause more damage than an army. Or maybe they understood something darker. That fear works. That silence spreads faster than debate. Whatever the truth, the Inquisition left scars. And in the margins of those scars, many see the faint fingerprints of the Jesuits. Not because they were the loudest, but because they were the ones who never had to speak at all. Not all assassins carry blades. Some carry books. Some carry vials. Some carry the weight of a secret whispered behind a curtain. The Jesuits were never known for brute force. They didn't ride into battle or duel in the streets. But some believe they used other tools. Tools are just as deadly and far harder to trace. Ink, poison, secrets. There are stories buried in old reports. A nobleman who died suddenly after meeting with a Jesuit advisor. A letter that turned an ally into an enemy overnight. A priest who disappeared after confession and was never seen again. Nothing was ever proven. But the rumors never stopped. The Jesuits were masters of information. They knew who was rising, who was falling, who posed a threat to the church. And when words failed, some believe they acted in shadows, quietly, permanently. Poison was my favorite theory. Tasteless, odorless, impossible to trace in those days. A few drops in wine, a small dose in bread. Death that looks like illness, suddenly tragic, but natural. And because Jesuits were often confessors or advisors, no one questioned their presence. They were trusted. That was their greatest weapon. Then there were the documents, the letters that never existed, the ones that appeared at just the right time. A forged order from a king, a fake accusation from a rival, a twisted quote in a sermon. One piece of paper could destroy a life. And the Jesuits had access to libraries and press translators. They knew how to make a lie look like truth. Some say they never needed to kill with poison or forge a document. All they needed was the booth, the confessional, where men spoke freely about sins and fears and plans. The Jesuits remembered everything. They had no notebooks, no recordings, just memory, sharpened by years of training. If someone confessed something dangerous, it might never leave the booth, or it might be passed along carefully, quietly, to someone who could do something about it. This is where the line blurs. Were they protecting the faith, or eliminating threats? Did they act with approval, or were these the decisions of individual men doing what they believed was right? Some say the Jesuits kept lists of people too dangerous to let live. Some say they were behind key deaths that shifted the course of empires. Others say it's all a myth, just fear wrapped in stories. But think about it. If you had the power to erase someone without a trace, to shape history with one whispered word, to save a kingdom with one silent act, would you use it? And if you did, who would ever know? Ink instead of iron, a vial instead of a blade, a name removed from history instead of a body left in the street. That's what made the rumors so chilling. Not the violence, but the silence. Because when the Jesuits moved in the shadows, it wasn't with armies. It was with knowledge. And knowledge in the right hands can kill just as surely as any sword. At first they were praised. Brilliant minds, loyal hearts, the Pope's chosen order. The Jesuits were welcomed into cities and courts like heroes. But that didn't last. Because the more influence they gained, the more people started to ask questions. Why did they always know everything? Why did kings listen to them more than ministers? Why did they never seem to lose? And slowly admiration turned to suspicion, then to fear. Monarchs began to see the pattern. Jesuit advisors had the ear of rulers across Europe. And not just Catholic ones. They were everywhere. In universities, in missions, in palaces. They were shaping minds and decisions quietly, without votes, without armies. That kind of invisible influence made kings nervous. Reformers hated them, especially during the rise of Protestant movements. While others debated doctrine, the Jesuits attacked ideas. They weren't just defending Catholic beliefs. They were exposing their enemies, calling out books, organizing debates, and winning them. They were clever, sharp, merciless with words. To reformers, this wasn't faith. It was a war. And the Jesuits were elite soldiers armed with logic instead of steel. Preachers warned their flocks. Watch for the man in black. He smiles. He listens. And then he strikes. Not with fists. With questions. With doubt. With silence. But the biggest surprise was that even some popes began to worry. Because while the Jesuits swore loyalty to the papacy, they often acted on their own. They had their own rules, their own leaders, their own global network. A pope could give an order, but would the Jesuit general follow it? Or would he interpret it? Would he delay? Would he politely disagree? And that scared the Vatican. The Society of Jesus wasn't like any other order. Monks stayed in monasteries. Nuns stayed in convents, but Jesuits were everywhere, preaching, teaching, advising, whispering, and if they ever turned against Rome, no one would see it coming. So enemies began to move. Laws were passed, missions shut down. In some countries, Jesuits were expelled completely. France, Portugal, Spain. Entire nations turned on them, saying they were too political, too powerful, too mysterious. Some even accused them of causing revolts. manipulating kings and assassinating threats. None of it was proven, but none of it disappeared either. The whispers grew louder. The Jesuits were called the Shadow Church, the Invisible Empire, enemies of the cross not because they hated Christ, but because they were changing what his church meant. Still, the Jesuits said nothing. They kept teaching, keep advising, keep moving, but they were no longer untouchable. And when even the Vatican started pulling back, when even the Pope began to hesitate, the message was clear. The Society of Jesus had become too big, too fast, too powerful. What began as a mission of faith had turned into something else. Something harder to control. Something harder to trust. And that made them dangerous. Not because of what they did, but because of what they could do. You don't get expelled from over 80 nations unless people are afraid of you. And the Jesuits were feared. Not because they carried swords. Not because they started riots. But because they could walk into a kingdom and within a few years, be advising the king, teaching his children, influencing his laws, and shaping his beliefs. All while smiling politely and preaching peace. At some point, rulers across Europe started connecting the dots. The Jesuits were everywhere. In schools, courts, missions, and confessionals. They weren't just spreading religion. They were building networks. And no one could prove exactly what they were doing. But the results were always the same. Power shifted. Minds changed. Secrets traveled. So countries started pushing back. Portugal was first. In 1759, they didn't just ban the Jesuits. They arrested them, took their schools, burned their papers, accused them of conspiracy, treason, and manipulating the royal family. Then came France, then Spain, then Naples. One by one, governments declared that the Jesuits were too dangerous to allow inside their borders. Even Catholic nations turned on them. And the accusations weren't small. Some said the Jesuits were behind revolts. Others claimed they ran secret banks. Some even believed they were trying to form a shadow government under the Pope. The craziest part, most of it was whispered, not proven. But fear doesn't need proof. It just needs patterns. In 1773, the pressure got so intense that even the Vatican caved. Pope Clement XIV officially suppressed the Society of Jesus, shut it down, ordered it dissolved. Jesuit schools were closed, libraries seized, priests scattered. It looked like the end. But the Jesuits didn't vanish. They adapted. In Russia, Catherine the Great refused to enforce the suppression. She liked their schools. In Prussia, they were allowed to keep teaching. In underground networks, they kept writing, thinking, and planning. They became ghosts, still working, still loyal, still everywhere. And in 1814, after years of silence, Pope Pius VII restored them. Officially, publicly, the Jesuits were back, and stronger than ever. That's the strange thing. Every time they were banned, they returned. Not angry, not violent, just determined, because they believed in their mission, and they were trained to endure. You could take their buildings, but not their ideas. You could burn their books, but not their minds. It was like trying to erase ink that sinks into the page. The more you scrub, the deeper it spreads. So why did they keep coming back? Because the world kept needing what they offered. Intelligence, strategy, loyalty, education, and maybe because the church never fully let them go. Even when they were scared of them. The Jesuits had been called saints, spies, scholars, assassins. And no matter what label they were given, they survived. Not by force, but by patience. They weren't just part of history. They were experts at surviving it. And that's what made them unstoppable. Even empires couldn't erase them. He doesn't wear white. He doesn't wave from balconies. He doesn't smile for cameras or bless crowds. But some say his power goes deeper than the Pope's. They call him the Superior General. But most people know him by another name, the Black Pope. He leads the Society of Jesus, not as a figurehead but as a commander. While other religious orders vote and debate, the Jesuits obey. When the Superior General gives an order, it's final. No arguing. No hesitation. Every Jesuit around the world answers to him. And only him. That kind of authority makes people nervous, especially when it's hidden behind silence and shadow. The Superior General doesn't give public speeches. He doesn't travel with an army. But he knows what's happening in nearly every country, every major city, every important court. His reach stretches across continents through the Jesuit network of schools, missions, and advisors. Some historians say he has more real-time information than most governments, because Jesuits are trained to observe, to listen, to report, and their loyalty is absolute. They don't serve their country, they serve the order, and the order serves him. This is why people fear him. The Pope is a symbol of unity, a shepherd of faith. But the Black Pope is a strategist, tactician, a man chosen not just for holiness, but for brilliance. He is expected to be sharp, disciplined, and politically skilled. And once he's elected, he stays in power for life. No one votes him out. No one questions his decisions. And unlike the White Pope, he doesn't have to deal with the public. Over the years, whispers have followed him, that he controls not just Jesuits, but entire governments, that he's been behind secret deals and political shifts, that when popes fall silent or die suddenly, the Black Pope already knows the next move. None of this is proven, but fear doesn't wait for proof. It grows in the gaps between power and secrecy, and the Superior General operates entirely in that space. Even within the Church, some worry about him, because he answers to no bishop, no cardinal, not even the Pope directly. His power comes from the vow, that fourth vow of obedience, not to Rome, but to the person of the Pope, which means, if he believes he's serving the Pope's will, he can act freely. Even if the Pope hasn't said a word. That's a dangerous kind of freedom. And yet he remains almost invisible. No scandals, no speeches, just orders moving through the ranks, missions launched, conflicts handled, silence maintained. You'll never see his face on the news. You probably don't know his name. But behind every Jesuit classroom, every mission post, every whisper in power, there is one man in black watching, guiding, deciding. He doesn't need a throne, just control. And he has it. That's why some say the Black Pope isn't just a nickname. It's a warning. Because when you rule without being seen, there's no limit to what you can do. At the heart of Rome stands the Vatican, a city within a city, a kingdom without borders. Most people know the man in white, the Pope, the smiling figure on the balconies, the one who kisses babies and blesses the faithful. But behind the scenes, there's another figure, dressed in black, quiet, powerful, and some say, just as important. They call him the Black Pope, the Superior General of the Jesuits. He doesn't stand beside the Pope. He stands behind him, not in a crowd, but in the structure, in the strategy, in the system that shapes how the Church moves. This isn't just a nickname. It's a symbol of dual power. Two leaders, one in white, one in black, one seen, one hidden. And for centuries, people have asked the same question. Who really runs the Vatican? The White Pope is the spiritual leader, chosen by the cardinals, loved by the crowds, but he also faces pressure, politics, public opinion, media. Meanwhile, the Black Pope moves differently. No spotlight, no interviews, just influence. Authority that stretches through every Jesuit mission school and secret archive. Inside the Vatican walls, they don't clash, at least not openly. But they don't work the same way either. The White Pope blesses the world. The Black Pope organizes it, shape it, guard it. There are whispers that the Jesuits run a parallel system, their own chain of command, their own records, even their own rules. And while they vow obedience to the Pope, their loyalty is often to the mission. And the mission is decided by the Black Pope. That's where things get strange. Because when power is shared in silence, it's hard to track who's making the real decisions. A speech may come from the White Pope, but the policy behind it might come from a room the public never sees, from a voice that's never quoted, from Rome's dark twin. And it's not just about religion. The Vatican has its own bank, its own diplomacy, its own intelligence. And the Jesuits are trained to understand all of it. Some have sat in government cabinets. Others advised kings. Many work in universities, where the next generation of leaders is shaped. So imagine a structure where the face is warm and open, but the mind is sharp and hidden. One pope wears gold, the other wears shadows. This isn't fiction. It's history. Over 400 years of influence, built on secrecy, strategy, and silence. A system that doesn't need headlines because it never wanted them. Some say the balance is perfect. Faith and reason, spirit and order. But others say it's dangerous. Because when one hand blesses and the other pulls strings, who do you trust? Rome has two popes. One for the world to see, and one for those who already know. One speaks to the people, the other speaks to power. And if the Church ever needed to shift history, bend timelines, or erase a threat, it wouldn't be the man in white who made the call. It would be the one in black. Most people have heard of the Vatican Library, a place filled with ancient scrolls, lost gospels, forbidden texts, and dusty books no one outside the Church is allowed to touch. But what if there was another archive? One even more secret. One hidden not under the Vatican but controlled entirely by the Jesuits. Locked away from the world. And maybe even from the Pope himself. The Society of Jesus has always kept records. Missions. Confessions. Political advice. Strange discoveries. Over the centuries, those records piled up. Letters from kings. Reports from missionaries deep in foreign empires. Warnings about heresies. Maps never published. Journals filled with knowledge that didn't fit the Church's public story. But unlike the Vatican Library, the Jesuit archives aren't in one place. They're scattered, hidden in basements under colleges, buried in seminaries behind walls of silence. Some are rumored to be in Rome, others in Spain. Some say parts were moved to South America during the suppression of the order. Not to hide from enemies, but to keep the knowledge safe, even if the church turned against them. And what's in these archives? That's the real mystery. There are rumors of books that describe pre-Christian technology, letters that prove entire timelines were rewritten, scientific discoveries that never saw the light of day because they clashed with doctrine, even old orders for assassination or political manipulation. Nothing officially confirmed, but too many whispers to ignore. Jesuits were taught to write everything down. Every meeting, every conversation, every mission. And they didn't just store facts. They stored meaning, interpretation, strategy. It wasn't just what happened. It was why, and what should be done about it. That kind of knowledge is power. Not the kind you put on display, but the kind you lock away and use when needed. Even within the church, not everyone is allowed to see Jesuit records. Not even cardinals. Sometimes not even popes, because the Jesuits answer first to their superior general. And the general decides what gets shared, what stays buried, and what gets erased completely. This is why some call their archives the real vault of secrets. Because the Vatican library may be massive, but it's a library. The Jesuit records are something else. Alive, active, guarded. Not just forgotten history, but history that could still change the present if revealed. Imagine a document that proves a saint never existed, or that a war was started by forged letters, or that a scientific breakthrough was hidden to keep power in the right hands. If those papers exist, they're not in plain sight. They're in the society's grip, filed, sealed, and protected. And maybe that's why no one talks about it. Because if the truth ever got out, it wouldn't just shake faith. It would fracture history. The Jesuits never needed armies to rule. Just words. Just silence. Just records. No one else could touch. And somewhere in those pages, the real story of the world might still be waiting. Quiet, patient, and very well protected. Imagine stepping into a quiet church. Candles flickering. Stained glass glowing. You kneel. You confess. You speak secrets you wouldn't even tell your best friend. Because the man behind the screen isn't just anyone. He's a priest, a Jesuit, and in that moment you trust him with your soul. But what happens to the things you say after you leave? The confession booth is one of the most sacred places in Catholic tradition. It's supposed to be a vault of forgiveness, a place where sins are released and never spoken of again. But when the Jesuits entered the picture, that silence took on a new meaning. Jesuits were not like ordinary priests. They were trained listeners, observers, strategists. When someone came to confess, it wasn't just a spiritual moment. It was a window into human behavior, into politics, into power, and the Jesuits listened carefully. Now, imagine that happening not in one city, but across hundreds of cities, across continents, dozens, maybe hundreds of confessionals, all feeding information back to the same network. One man tells of a nobleman's plans. Another admits fears about rebellion. A third mentions a scientific discovery that threatens the Church's teachings. All these whispers taken alone might seem harmless, but woven together they formed something else. Intelligence. Jesuits didn't carry weapons, but they carried knowledge, and they used that knowledge to protect the Church, or guide it, or maybe even control it, depending on who you ask. There were no reports filed, no tapes, just memory. Jesuits were trained to remember details with perfect clarity. And when something important was heard, it didn't stay in that booth. It moved, quietly, to the right people, in the right rooms. Some believe this was how the Jesuits stayed ahead. They knew when revolts were coming before they started. They knew which kings were doubting Rome. They knew what scientists were hiding. All because people trusted the screen, the silence, the black robe, and not all confessions came from strangers. Royals confessed. Generals confessed. Other priests confessed. The more power someone had, the more likely they had something to hide. And the Jesuits were always there to hear it. Of course, none of this was official. The Church never admitted to using confessionals as spy posts. The Jesuits denied everything. And maybe most of them truly were focused only on saving souls. But if even a few used the booth as a tool for influence, then the whole system becomes something darker. A whisper in one city becomes a plan in another. A rumor in a booth becomes a shift in history. And the person confessing never even knows. Because that's the brilliance of it. No violence. No threats. Just words spoken freely behind a wooden wall. Words that could topple a man or save a nation. All depending on who was listening. And the Jesuits were always listening. In the grand halls of the Vatican, everything looks calm. Marble floors, golden altars, gentle hymns echoing through candlelit chapels. But behind the beauty, there are whispers. Whispers of men who died too suddenly, too clean. Popes who got sick after strange dinners. Cardinals who collapsed with no warning. And always the same question at the edge of those whispers. Was the chalice poisoned? The Church has always had enemies. But sometimes the biggest threats came from inside. Power struggles. Hidden agendas. Secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. And when words weren't enough, some believe poison took their place. Throughout history, a few deaths stand out. Pope Clement XIV signed the decree to suppress the Jesuits in 1773. Not long after, he fell violently ill. He complained of stomach pain. His skin turned pale. He wasted away quickly. Some said it was natural. Others were not so sure. Rumors swirled that he had been poisoned. Not by enemies of the Church, but by defenders of the order he had just tried to erase. No proof, no confession, just silence, and a funeral. Then there were the mysterious deaths in royal courts. Kings and advisors who had grown critical of Jesuit influence. Some fell ill after drinking wine. Others suffered sudden strokes with no history of illness. Some reports even claimed that certain Jesuit-trained chemists had access to rare toxins. Poisons that left no trace, no scent, no color, just results. It's easy to dismiss these stories. Conspiracy theories grow like vines in the dark. But the pattern keeps showing up. Political resistance followed by an unexplained death. Silence. Then reshuffling. And always the Jesuits are still standing, quiet, calm, untouched. Did they actually kill people? Or did their enemies just need someone to blame? Maybe it was both. Maybe no one will ever know. What made the rumors more believable was how much training Jesuits had. They studied science, medicine, alchemy. They understood the body. They understood fear. They understood the timing. And if you wanted to remove a threat without starting a war, you didn't need an army. Just a well-timed sip from the wrong cup. Even confessionals may have played a role. Some whispered that Jesuits learned secrets from powerful men, then used those secrets as leverage. If someone couldn't be swayed, maybe they could be silenced. Not always by poison, sometimes by blackmail, sometimes by exile. But when all else failed, poison was the cleanest way. Or so the stories say. To this day, there are no official documents proving Jesuit assassinations. But that's the point. The perfect poison leaves nothing behind. No fingerprints, no weapon, just a closed coffin and a quiet prayer. And maybe that's why the chalice still causes fear. Because in a place where power hides behind faith, the dead don't talk. But the rumors never stop. And someone always knew which cup to pour. Imagine someone asks you a question. A dangerous question. One that could get someone killed or uncover something sacred. Now imagine you answer it, but not fully. You say something technically true, but leave out just enough to mislead them. You didn't lie, but you didn't really tell the truth either. That's the heart of something called mental reservation. And the Jesuits were masters of it. The doctrine of mental reservation was not about casual lying. It was a system, a way of thinking, a rule book for when truth could be bent in service of something greater. The idea was simple. If telling the truth would cause harm or break trust with God, then it was better to speak carefully, selectively, even deceptively, if necessary. This wasn't invented by the Jesuits, but they took it further than anyone else. In the middle of war, heresy, and political chaos, they needed tools. And silence wasn't always enough. Sometimes they needed to speak, but without revealing everything. For example, if a priest was hiding refugees and someone came asking, "Have you seen them?" The priest might say, "I have not seen them today," even if they had. The wordplay wasn't a joke. It was protection. It allowed the Jesuit to keep their vow without betraying a soul. The truth was hidden inside the sentence, like a locked room behind a polite smile. Some Jesuits even trained in how to say things with hidden meanings. Words layered with double intentions. Tone shifts that turned facts into fog. To them, this wasn't dishonesty. It was defense, like wearing armor made of language. But to outsiders, it looked like manipulation. And it scared people. Popes questioned it. Philosophers attacked it. Enemies used it as proof that Jesuits couldn't be trusted. They were accused of lying without guilt, twisting logic, until right and wrong became impossible to tell apart. If a Jesuit could justify anything by saying it served a greater good, where was the line? Where did truth end and control begin? And that's what made it powerful. Because if you believe you are serving God, then even a silence can be sacred. Even a trick can be holy. The Jesuits weren't playing games. They believed they were preserving souls, saving lives, and protecting the mission. And if that meant hiding a truth behind a carefully chosen word, so be it. It wasn't about fooling the world. It was about staying loyal to something bigger than any single conversation. To this day, mental reservation remains controversial. Some defend it. Some call it dangerous. But one thing is clear. In the hands of the Jesuits, it became more than a doctrine. It became a tool, a shield, a secret key to speak in the shadows while standing in the light. And if truth is power, then knowing how to shape it became the greatest weapon of all. In the dim light of candlelit chambers, Jesuits once studied more than just scripture. Behind monastery walls and beneath university towers, they opened books filled not with prayers, but with symbols, stars, numbers, secrets, and sometimes the ingredients for something far more dangerous than heresy: alchemy. Most people think of alchemy as old magic, turning lead into gold, mixing potions, wild bearded men whispering to fire. But to the Jesuits, alchemy was something else. A hidden science, a doorway, a map of the world drawn in codes instead of commandments. While the Church publicly warned against forbidden knowledge, some Jesuits walked straight into it. Carefully, quietly, they believed all knowledge came from God, even the kind that others feared. Astronomy, chemistry, mathematics. It was all part of a larger truth, one that couldn't always be explained through scripture alone. And that's where it got complicated. Jesuits ran some of the most advanced schools in Europe. Behind those thick stone walls, they taught the children of kings, the minds of tomorrow, but not just about faith. They taught physics, natural philosophy, secret geometry. Some of their students would go on to lead revolutions in science. Others would change the course of history in ways never written down. The Jesuits didn't just teach, they explored. They corresponded with other thinkers, traveling to distant lands, collected strange artifacts, studied ancient texts long buried in forgotten languages. Some even joined or secretly influenced esoteric schools, groups that believed wisdom came from ancient civilizations lost beneath time. It wasn't always safe. The line between knowledge and heresy was razor thin. Talk too openly and you could be labeled a traitor to God. Stay silent too long and you risk losing the truth. The Jesuits balanced on that line for centuries. There are rumors that some Jesuits discovered more than they ever admitted. Maps of ancient power grids, codes hidden in cathedrals, astronomical alignments that predicted events long before telescopes existed. Even experiments with chemicals and metals that the Church refused to acknowledge. And when those discoveries didn't fit the official timeline, they disappeared. Not destroyed, just moved, hidden in vaults, or passed through whispers to those who could understand. Some say the Jesuits knew how to manipulate light long before Newton, that they discovered principles of flight before Da Vinci, that their symbols were carved into the walls of secret societies and forgotten tombs. Always watching, always learning, but they never called it alchemy. They called it study, observation, natural law. But behind the scenes they knew it was something more. A bridge between spirit and science, faith and formula. And in those quiet rooms filled with smoke and parchment, they didn't just ask how the world worked. They asked why someone wanted to keep that knowledge buried. Because sometimes it wasn't the danger of what they found. It was the danger of who might find out. Sometimes the most dangerous killers don't carry knives. They don't fire bullets. They don't even leave a trace. They just wait, plan. And when the moment is right, they strike without ever being seen. No blood, no screams, just a body found in the morning, a breath taken one day and never given back. Throughout history, some deaths feel too perfect, too quiet, a sudden illness, a collapse in the middle of a speech, a heart that stops with no warning. And behind these moments lie whispers, rumors that maybe the person didn't just die. Maybe they were removed, carefully, politely, for the sake of a mission. The Jesuits were not known for violence. That's what made them terrifying. They didn't start wars. They ended conversations. Silently, permanently. Take the death of King Henry III of France, a ruler torn between Protestants and Catholics. The Jesuits were accused of playing both sides, guiding movements, stirring unrest. And when the king was assassinated, the fallout led to more chaos, more control for those who knew how to use it. Then there was Tsar Alexander I of Russia. He expelled the Jesuits in 1820. Months later, he died under strange conditions. Officially, it was an illness, but some reports claimed his symptoms didn't match. Some say he didn't even die but was replaced, escaped, or silenced. Cardinal Juan de Lugo, Pope Clement XIV, monarchs, scholars, priests, all dead under conditions that raised eyebrows but never alarms. The church would mourn, nations would move on, but somewhere in the shadows, someone might have crossed a name off a list. What makes these deaths so chilling is how normal they look. No one suspects the chalice, the ink, the handshake. No one questions the confession that happened the day before. No one sees the silent figure slipping out the back door. Jesuits trained in discipline, patience, strategy. And if a threat emerged, someone speaking too freely or pulling the church off course, they knew how to act. Not with a sword, but with silence. The real power wasn't in taking life. It was in making it look like nothing happened. That's how history forgets. That's how secrets stay buried. And because the Jesuits swore loyalty to the Pope alone, their actions were shielded, protected, explained away. A death might raise suspicion, but never proof. A letter might hint at danger, but never confirm it. Even today, the records are clean. No arrests, no trials, just stories passed in low voices, names scratched out of history books, monuments with missing plaques. Assassins without blades don't leave bodies in alleys. They leave legacies no one questions. They rewrite the endings. And when the story is finished, it's as if the threat never existed at all. No blood, no weapon, just one less obstacle between the order and its mission. They were never supposed to work together. On the surface, the Jesuits and the Freemasons couldn't be more different. One swore loyalty to the Pope. The other rejected all forms of centralized religion. One moved through churches in black robes. The others gathered in temples behind closed doors. But in the shadows, things were never that simple. The Jesuit-Freemason paradox is one of the strangest power games in history. Sometimes they were bitter enemies. Other times they seemed to share the same goals. And the deeper you look, the more confusing it gets. The Catholic Church has officially condemned Freemasonry for centuries, called it dangerous, heretical, even satanic. And yet some of the most powerful decisions in Europe seem to carry the fingerprints of both groups. Revolutions, reforms, wars that didn't make sense, treaties that favored no one but a few silent architects. Jesuits were experts in loyalty, structure, order. Their system ran like a military machine, but Freemasons operated through mystery, symbols, rituals. They believed in hidden truths and ancient knowledge. And in strange ways, both groups were after the same thing: influence, access, control. There are letters, documents, clues buried in archives and forgotten libraries. They hint at secret meetings between high-level Jesuits and senior Masonic leaders. Agreements made in darkness, mutual targets, shared enemies, but nothing confirmed, nothing proven, just enough to keep the questions alive. Some say the rivalry was real. The Jesuits saw the Freemasons as a threat to church unity. The Masons viewed Jesuits as Vatican spies. There were cases where Jesuits were accused of infiltrating Masonic lodges to gather secrets. In other stories, Freemasons tried to expose Jesuit influence in politics and education. But other sources tell a different story. Behind the scenes, the two groups worked together quietly. While they appeared to fight in public, they were dividing the world like a chessboard, each claiming pieces, each moving carefully toward a shared future no one else could see. It gets even stranger when you realize how similar some of their symbols are. The eye, the triangle, the light emerging from darkness. Coincidence? Or a sign that both groups pulled from the same ancient source? The paradox is this. If they were enemies, why did their goals often align? And if they were allies, why did they pretend to hate each other for so long? Maybe the answer is both. Maybe they were rivals fighting for the same throne, or secret partners keeping the rest of the world distracted. While we watched their war, they rewrote the rules. In the end, no one really knows. The Jesuit archives are sealed. The Freemason records are selective. But what we do know is that the world changed while they watched from the shadows. And whether they were fighting or cooperating, the result was the same. They shaped history, and they never asked permission. In 1773, something happened that shocked even the most loyal followers of the Church. The Pope issued an order that erased the Jesuit order from existence. Just like that, their schools were shut down. Their leaders were arrested or exiled. Their missions dissolved into silence. The Society of Jesus had been erased by the very power it served. But it wasn't because of one mistake. The Jesuits had made enemies, powerful ones. All across Europe, kings and nobles were becoming suspicious. Jesuits controlled elite schools. They advised royalty. They ran missions in places no other European had ever gone. Some monarchs believed they were meddling in state affairs. Others feared they were building a secret empire of minds. And those fears started to spread. In Portugal, Jesuits were accused of supporting uprisings. In France, they were blamed for manipulating trade. In Spain, they were seen as too loyal to Rome instead of the crown. And when enough rulers felt threatened, they turned their eyes toward the Vatican. The pressure was intense. The kings of France, Spain, Naples, and Parma demanded action. They wanted the Pope to break the Jesuits once and for all. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat. Obey or lose their loyalty. Obey or see the Church divided. Pope Clement XIV gave in. He signed a decree called Dominus AC Redempta. It claimed the Jesuits had become a danger to the peace of the Church. And with a few words, everything they built was officially gone. But that's only what history books say. The truth is the Jesuits didn't vanish. They just moved underground. Some disguised themselves inside other religious orders. Others fled to places where the decree was ignored, like Russia and Prussia. There, they continued teaching and writing and preparing. In secret, they passed knowledge to the next generation. In silence, they survived. They waited for the world to change. And it did. In 1814, the ban was lifted. A new pope restored the Society of Jesus, not as a new group, as the same order that had never truly disappeared. The Jesuits returned to power with new strategies and old lessons. They knew how to vanish when needed, how to rebuild from the shadows, how to influence without being seen. The years of suppression taught them something important. That real power doesn't come from permission, comes from patience. from knowledge, from knowing how to shape the future even when the world is watching someone else. The Jesuits had been erased on paper, but ideas are hard to kill, and when they returned, they were sharper, quieter, stronger. The society survived because they were never just a religious order. They were a system, a network, a memory that refused to die. And in the silence, they only grew louder. They were gone, erased by the very church they served. For 41 years, the Society of Jesus didn't exist. No robes, no schools, no missions, just silence. But silence doesn't mean surrender, and disappearance is not the same as death. The Jesuits were suppressed in 1773, banned by a pope, hunted by kings. Their libraries were seized, their leaders scattered. But they didn't vanish. Not really. They simply changed shape. In Russia and Prussia, the suppression was ignored. Jesuits continued their work quietly, under the protection of rulers who valued their knowledge more than they feared their influence. In secret, they taught. In secret, they trained. In secret, they waited. They understood something most people didn't. That the world moves in cycles. Power rises and falls. The minds that control the future are shaped when no one is watching. And while Europe tore itself apart through revolutions and wars, the Jesuits were building. Not with armies, with ideas. Then, in 1814, the silence ended. Pope Pius VII issued a decree that restored the Society of Jesus. He brought them back with full authority. No conditions, no limits. It wasn't just a return. It was a resurrection. But they didn't come back the same. This time, the Jesuits were smarter. They had learned what it meant to be a threat. They knew how the world saw them. So they stepped back from the spotlight. They stopped drawing lines in the sand. They let others believe the fire was gone, all while rebuilding their network behind the curtain. Their schools reopened, but now they trained not just priests. They trained scientists, politicians, thinkers, future leaders. Their missions restarted. But this time with more purpose, less visibility. Their writings reappeared, but filled with deeper layers, safer language, hidden meanings. They expanded quietly, no longer just in Europe, but across the world. Asia, Africa, the Americas, every continent became part of their new map. They weren't just spreading religion. They were mapping influence, building trust, learning the weaknesses of every empire they touched. And through it all, they kept their structure, their chain of command, their loyalty to the superior general, a man more secretive than the Pope, a man many feared even more. The world thought the Jesuits had been broken, but they had only been refined. Like iron pulled from fire, harder, stronger, sharper. Their enemies thought suppression was the end. But it became a lesson. Power doesn't need to be loud. Influencers don't always wear robes. And control often comes from those you cannot see. By the time the Jesuits returned, most people had already forgotten why they were feared in the first place. That was their advantage, because a name erased from the record becomes a ghost. And ghosts can walk through walls, speak in silence, move without leaving a trace. The resurrection of the order wasn't just a comeback. It was a warning. You can silence a voice, but you can't kill a system that knows how to wait. It started with whispers, rumors in royal courts, quiet suspicions among bishops, that the Jesuits had not just returned to the church, but had taken control of it from the inside. That the men once erased were now calling the shots. Not from the pulpit, but from behind the curtain. No one ever saw a coup. There were no swords drawn. No Vatican walls stormed. But slowly the signs began to show. Jesuit-trained thinkers filled key roles. Jesuit advisors stood closer to the Pope than ever before. And the Church's direction began to shift. Not all at once. Just small changes. Subtle at first. Until one day the question became impossible to ignore. Who was really steering the ship? The Society of Jesus had always been a group of strategists. They knew the timing. They knew the influence. They knew how to build loyalty from the ground up. For centuries, they trained leaders long before they ever wore crowns or robes. So when the Jesuits came back from suppression, they didn't just rebuild their own order. They rewired the Church itself. Their schools shaped generations of priests. Their writings influenced theology. Their methods took root in Vatican policies. And their fourth vow to obey the Pope without question became a tool. Because the higher they climbed, the more likely it was that the Pope was one of their own. In 2013, something happened that shook the world. For the first time in history, a Jesuit became Pope. Pope Francis, a man trained in the order's ways, a man formed in the discipline of Loyola. Some saw it as a moment of unity. Others saw it as confirmation of something far older, that the Jesuits had been building toward this for centuries. But the takeover didn't start in 2013. That was just when it became visible. Long before that, the Jesuits had already influenced how the Church handled science, how it viewed politics, and how it navigated modern issues. They weren't just servants of the Pope. They had become the architects of his message. Some say it was a silent revolution. Over time, the Society of Jesus replaced the old guard with their own. Not with force, but with formation. That when you shape the minds of future leaders, you don't need to fight for power. You just wait until they rise. Others believe the Church welcomed them back on purpose. That the world had grown too complicated, and only the Jesuits had the tools to navigate it. They had the networks, the education, and the strategy. Maybe it wasn't a takeover. Maybe it was survival. But one truth remains. The Jesuits are no longer just an order within the Church. They are its mind, its memory, its unseen hand. If there was ever a Vatican takeover, it didn't happen with noise. It happened in silence. Through books, through classrooms, through confessions and counsel and carefully planted seeds. And by the time the world noticed, it had already happened. When ships first arrived on the shores of the Americas, they didn't just carry soldiers and explorers. Hidden among them were men in black robes, carrying crosses, maps, and instructions. The Jesuits had entered the New World. But they weren't just there to preach. They were there to build something lasting, something powerful. They said it was about saving souls. They told stories of heaven and hell to people who had never heard Latin, never seen a book, never even imagined a world beyond their own forest or desert. And yet the Jesuits learned the local languages. They lived among the tribes. They adapted, but not without a purpose. In South America, Jesuit missions spread fast. They created what they called reductions. These were controlled villages where native people were gathered, taught to farm, baptized, and kept under watch. Some say it was protection. Others say it was a cage. Because once inside those missions, the outside world disappeared. The Jesuits had strict rules. No outside traders. No soldiers. Only God. But they were also building a kind of empire. A network of loyal, converted people who answered not to kings, but to the order. And in the jungle, they had their own rules, their own armies, even their own economy. It wasn't just about religion. It was about control. In North America, the story was different, but the goal was the same. Jesuits traveled deep into unfamiliar lands. They followed rivers, mapped the wilderness, and found tribes who had never heard of Europe. They offered peace in exchange for obedience, education in exchange for tradition. They wrote journals that described the people they met, sometimes with respect, sometimes with fear, but always with the mindset that these people had to change, had to be reshaped, because to the Jesuits, salvation meant replacing one world with another. But not everyone wanted to be saved. There were uprisings, villages burned, Jesuits captured or killed. Some were even martyred and later called saints. But for every story of a fallen priest, there was also a story of a culture broken, a language lost, a way of life erased, and still they returned, again and again. Even when colonial powers fought among themselves, the Jesuits kept working. They gathered intelligence, kept records of who traded what, who allied with who. They weren't just missionaries. They were also informants. By the time the governments of Europe began to question the Jesuits' power in the New World, it was already too late. The order had planted deep roots. Roots that reached through the soil of every colony and touched every empire. Some called it salvation. Others called it an invasion. But the truth sits in the space between. The Jesuits in the New World were not just bringing faith. They were reshaping memories, redrawing borders, and rewriting the rules of who got to speak and who got to disappear. And once that kind of power takes hold, it does not let go easily. America was born from revolution, a break from kings and empires, a promise of freedom and self-rule. But behind the noise of muskets and speeches, something quieter was moving, something older, something trained to work in silence. The Jesuits had arrived in the New World long before the Declaration of Independence. They came with books, with languages, with maps, and with a mission that didn't end at borders. They watched the rise of the colonies, studied the minds of the men who shaped them, and over time they began to shape something too. It started with education. Jesuits built schools that didn't just teach religion. They taught law, science, and philosophy. They trained young minds in logic and rhetoric. Not just how to believe, but how to argue, how to persuade, how to lead. Some of the earliest universities had Jesuit fingerprints on their walls, even if their name wasn't on the front gate. These schools produced thinkers. Many of them went on to become judges, writers, and founders. And even if they didn't wear black robes, they carried ideas planted by Jesuit teachers. Ideas about order, about structure, about loyalty to something greater than the self. But influence wasn't just in the classroom. It was also in the shadows. Secret societies were blooming in the young republic. Groups with ritual symbols and silence. Freemasons, Rosicrucians. Other names are even less known. And inside those circles, whispers of Jesuit connections began to surface. Similar oaths, similar hierarchies, similar missions. Some historians argue that Jesuits and Freemasons were enemies. Others believe they shared more than they admitted. Both were networks. Both believed in shaping the world through ideas, not force. Both understood that the future belonged to those who controlled knowledge. And while the Constitution promised freedom of religion, something deeper was being built. A system where influence didn't come from pulpits, but from conversations behind closed doors. From letters passed between trusted hands. From minds trained to see 5 moves ahead. Jesuits didn't need to run the government to influence it. They just needed to teach the people who would. By the 1800s, their presence was subtle but undeniable. Jesuit universities in cities like Washington, D.C. and St. Louis became magnets for the elite. Their graduates filled courtrooms, newspapers, and sometimes even the Vatican itself. And through it all, the Jesuits kept doing what they had always done. Building, waiting, shaping. Today the symbols are still there. Latin mottos carved in stone. Quiet chapels on ivy-covered campuses. Rituals in student clubs that trace back to older times. The architects of America wore many faces. Some carried flags. Some carried guns. But some carried books bound in black leather, and ideas sharp enough to bend the path of a nation. And while their names may not appear in bold letters in your history textbook, the Jesuits were there, drawing blueprints in silence, watching a new world rise, and leaving behind a structure that still holds. The Cold War wasn't just fought with bombs and spies. It was also fought with ideas, with stories, with silence. And hidden inside that long, quiet wall were men in black robes, carrying more than just prayers. They carried intelligence. They carried influence. And sometimes they carried secrets. While the world focused on nuclear weapons and spy planes, the Jesuits moved through a different battlefield. One built on belief, fear, and control. Behind the Iron Curtain, where religion was banned and churches were watched, some of the most dangerous missions didn't come from soldiers. They came from priests. Jesuits slipped into communist countries under false names or quiet invitations. They weren't always there to preach. Sometimes they were there to listen, to gather, to map the mood of the people and track movements that no one else could see. They sat in confessionals. They taught in underground schools. And they remembered everything. In Eastern Europe, whispers of Jesuit missions floated through the gray streets. Some disguised as teachers, others as diplomats. But they all had one thing in common. They reported back. Not just to Rome, sometimes to people far outside the church. In the West, the CIA was watching. They knew religion could be a weapon. Those hearts could shift borders. Jesuits with deep networks and a history of loyalty made perfect allies. Not all wore robes. Some worked in think tanks, universities, and intelligence briefings. They spoke many languages. They understood culture, and they could walk through places agents couldn't. But not every Jesuit was working for the same side. In Latin America, things got complicated. Jesuits stood with the poor. They marched with rebels. They wrote letters that challenged dictators. Some even died for it. They believed justice mattered more than politics. But to Washington and to Rome this was dangerous, because a priest who speaks for the people can light a fire. The Cold War split the Jesuit order in strange ways. Some whispered to presidents. Others whispered to peasants. And in between were the quiet watchers collecting stories no one was supposed to hear. Jesuits helped smuggle messages across borders. They translated intercepted conversations. They shaped public opinion with books and radio shows. and sometimes they were the only ones who saw the full map. By the time the Berlin Wall fell, some of the most important files weren't found in government vaults. They were hidden in church basements, sealed with ink and memory. Reports from cities that no longer exist. Names of contacts who vanished. Decisions made in rooms with no record. The Cold War may have looked like a fight between nations, but underneath it was also a war for the soul of the world. And the Jesuits stood right in the middle, sometimes as allies, sometimes as enemies, always as observers. They prayed, but they also planned, and in a world built on secrets that made them very powerful. For centuries the world watched the Pope, the man in white, the leader of the Catholic Church, standing on balconies, kissing babies, blessing crowds. But what if the one wearing the crown wasn't the one holding the power? What if the real decisions were shaped long before the Pope ever spoke a word? Behind every pope stands an army of advisors, scholars, strategists, confessors, and among them the Jesuits have always had a special role. Not loud, not visible, but precise, loyal, trained to guide from the shadows. Even when a pope wasn't a Jesuit, he was often surrounded by them. Men who had studied longer, thought deeper, and played the long game. These were not simple priests. These were master planners, trained in persuasion, language, politics, and control. The Jesuits understood how to place the right words in the right ears, how to create movements without leaving fingerprints, how to influence the direction of the Church, not with force but with formation. Some popes came from Jesuit universities. Some had Jesuit confessors. Others read letters shaped by Jesuit logic. And whether they knew it or not, many popes carried messages written by someone else's hand. The Vatican is a city of rituals, but also of secrets. The Pope may speak to the world, but someone always shapes the message. And the Society of Jesus has been writing those scripts for a long time. There are popes who tried to resist, who made changes, who spoke too freely. Some were met with sudden illness or quiet pressure. Others found their reforms blocked, stalled, or slowly undone. Not by open rebellion, but by unseen resistance. It's not that every Jesuit controlled every pope. But the deeper question is this. If you control the education, if you write the doctrine, if you guide the conscience of the man in charge, do you need to sit on the throne? You can design a pope without ever becoming one. And when a Jesuit finally did become pope, it wasn't the start of something new. It was the final move in a game already won. Pope Francis didn't rise from nowhere. His path was prepared. His ideas were shaped by decades within the order. He was not just a pope. He was a product of design. Some say the white robes are only for the public, that real decisions happen in black, that the one who smiles on camera follows a script written in rooms, lit by candlelight and silence. And when you look back at the big turns in church history, when doctrines shifted, when alliances broke, when new ideas were accepted, you'll often find the same fingerprints behind it all. The world sees a pope, but behind the throne, behind the words, behind the robes, stands the long reach of the Jesuits. Not always seen, but always there. Because in the game of faith, power isn't always about who stands in the light. It's about who casts the longest shadow. When Jorge Mario Bergoglio stepped onto the balcony in 2013, the world met a new pope. But for the first time in history, he wasn't just any pope. He was a Jesuit, and that changed everything. He chose the name Francis. Simple, humble, a nod to a saint who lived in poverty. But behind that quiet image was a message. The Jesuits had waited centuries. They had taught, advised, whispered, and watched. Now, one of their own was in charge. This wasn't an accident. Bergoglio had climbed through the Jesuit ranks. He had led the Argentine province. He had studied the rules, served the structure, and carried the mission. And the Jesuit mission was always bigger than one man. It was about shaping the world. Francis came with a different style. He talked about climate change and inequality. He spoke of mercy, not fear. He challenged power instead of protecting it. Some people saw a hero, others saw a revolution. But Jesuits saw something else. A plan finally reaching its goal. Because for years they had operated from behind the curtain. Now they were center stage. Under Francis, the church began to change. Old traditions were softened. Old enemies were welcomed. He spoke to atheists. He met with scientists. He apologized for the sins of the past. It looked like kindness, but it was also a strategy. The Jesuits always knew how to adapt, to bend without breaking, to shift with history while still steering it. And Francis embodied that perfectly. He wasn't tearing the church down. He was rebuilding it from the inside. Some said he was too liberal. Others said he wasn't doing enough. But the truth was, he was doing exactly what Jesuit training had prepared him to do. Speak to all sides, stay calm under fire, and move the institution forward, even if it meant stepping on sacred toes. Behind the scenes, the old guard of the church resisted. They didn't like his changes. They feared his ideas. But Francis smiled. He kept moving, because he wasn't alone. The Jesuit network was global, quiet, loyal, ready. For the first time, the head of the church spoke with the voice of the Society of Jesus. Not just in tone, but in vision. A world guided by conscience, by education, by strategy, not force. And while people argued about his words, the bigger truth went unnoticed. That the order which had once been banned, exiled, and hunted, had now taken the highest seat. Not with violence, not with votes, but with patience. Francis was not just a pope. He was a signal, a final step in a long, silent campaign. One that didn't need swords or crowns, just time. The Jesuits had waited in the shadows for centuries. And when the moment came, they didn't storm the gates. They walked through the front door and turned off the lights behind them. And the world didn't even blink. When people think of the Jesuits, they imagine priests teaching in quiet classrooms, or whispering in ancient churches. But the truth stretches far beyond stained glass windows. Because while the world was building global systems, trade routes, and international laws, the Jesuits were already there laying the foundations in silence. They had no armies, no borders, but they had something more powerful: ideas. And those ideas moved faster than any soldier ever could. In the halls of the United Nations, where flags from every country wave above marble floors, Jesuit-trained voices have echoed for decades. Some served as advisors, others as diplomats. Many shaped policies without ever taking the spotlight. Their focus was always on the long game. Influence, not headlines. Jesuit schools taught future world leaders not just how to read and write, but how to think, how to argue, how to lead. These weren't just universities. They were factories of future power. and they popped up on every continent, training presidents, judges, bankers, and policymakers who all carried a similar way of thinking. Rooted in Jesuit logic, disguised as independent thought, education became one of their sharpest tools. Reforms pushed by think tanks and non-government groups often shared one thing in common. They came from Jesuit circles, not with crosses and collars but with graphs and studies. And while governments debated budgets, the Society of Jesus quietly rewrote the curriculum. The same happened in economics. Jesuit advisors met with global leaders, offering moral insights on poverty and inequality. But these weren't just spiritual suggestions. They were part of a larger structure that shaped how nations built systems of control. In South America, in Africa, in Asia, Jesuit missions often arrived before global corporations or peacekeepers. They mapped cultures, languages, and needs. Then others followed those paths, sometimes with deals, sometimes with doctrine. The lines blurred between faith and finance. And when critics pushed back, they faced not fire and sword, but calm reason. Jesuits rarely shouted. They asked questions, made suggestions, created frameworks, and left others to think the idea was theirs. This is how the cross was globalized, not just through cathedrals but through conferences, through treaties, through textbooks. It was not a conquest of land. It was a conquest of thought. Today, when a child in Nairobi learns the same economic theories as one in New York, when a diplomat in Geneva echoes values written in Rome, when leaders across the world speak of conscience and reform, there are Jesuit fingerprints behind the curtain. It is not a conspiracy of control. It is something older, a method, a strategy, a quiet shaping of the world's mind. And while churches may stand empty in some cities, Jesuit ideas still sit in boardrooms, universities, and government chambers. The cross didn't just go global. It went institutional, wrapped in logic, carried by suits, spoken in the language of progress, and guided by a mission that never needed to raise its voice to be heard. Confession used to happen in a small wooden booth, a whisper through a screen, priest listening, a soul unburdened. But the world has changed. The booths are gone. The screens are everywhere. And the ones listening now might not be wearing robes. The Jesuits have always moved with the times. They mastered print when books were powerful. They shaped minds when universities were born. Now they walk quietly through the world of code screens and algorithms. And while most people scroll, swipe and post without a second thought, someone is watching the patterns. Artificial intelligence isn't just about robots and smart assistants. It is about data, about knowing what you want before you ask, about shaping what you see before you choose. And in the quiet corners of ethics, labs, and tech councils, Jesuit-trained thinkers are already there. They speak of justice, privacy, and digital dignity. But beneath the soft language is something older, a system of guidance, of quiet influence. The same methods that shaped kings and popes are now shaping platforms and policies. Surveillance doesn't always come with cameras. Sometimes it comes through your phone, your laptop, your favorite app. And while governments build the hardware, Jesuits have helped shape the philosophy, the why behind the watch. They write reports on moral use. They sit on boards for tech companies. They advise schools and churches on how to protect the digital soul. But what if protection is just another form of control? Education reform is no longer about chalkboards. It is about screens in every hand, and lessons shaped by algorithms. Jesuit networks helped build global curricula, not with religion, with values, with carefully framed questions, with digital tools that seem neutral but carry quiet truths inside them. Media is no longer just television or newspapers. It is TikTok. It is YouTube. It is a flood of content, faster than thought. And Jesuits know the power of a story. They always have. Now they help shape content that forms hearts and minds under the radar. They do not preach fire and brimstone. They create documentaries, podcasts, books, interactive lessons, quietly designed to shift belief without confrontation. The digital world is a new confessional, but you do not step inside. It follows you. It learns from you. It knows your doubts, your fears, your dreams. And those who control it do not need to forgive you. They just need to guide your next thought. Behind the soft voices of tech ethics and educational policy are men trained to listen and shape, to ask without demanding, to steer without shouting. Jesuits in the digital age are no longer missionaries in boats. They are architects of attention. And as the world plugs in deeper every day, the ones who understand how to shape minds without force hold the real power, not through faith alone, but through the code beneath the screen, through the stories you think you chose, through the silence you never noticed. Most people think Christianity is fixed, a set of truths carved in stone, passed down from Jesus to the apostles to the church. But what if some of those truths were quietly edited, not erased, just bent, tilted, shifted 1 degree at a time? The Jesuits never needed to change the Bible. They only needed to change how people read it, how they heard it, how they felt it. And over time, that changed everything. They called it interpretation, a deeper reading, a more modern understanding. But behind those soft words was something sharper, a system of influence, a shadow doctrine. From the beginning, the Jesuits were trained not just in scripture but in psychology. They studied human behavior, language, memory, and emotion. They knew how to craft a message that could reach deep inside someone's soul and reshape it without force. They taught that salvation came not just through faith, but through obedience. That questioning authority could be pride. That silence could be wisdom. And that the true battle was not between good and evil, but between order and chaos. Sounds holy. Sounds wise. But listen closely, because when values like truth are redefined, obedience can become blindness. Mercy can become manipulation, and love can be used to control. Jesuit thinkers rewrote the image of Jesus, not with lies but with emphasis. They painted him as a gentle teacher, not a radical truth teller, as a symbol of peace, not a breaker of chains. And slowly people stopped asking hard questions. They just tried to behave. In their schools, their sermons, their books, they didn't preach fear. They offered structure, belonging, a worldview that fits neatly into the system they built. And in that system, the church was not just a guide. It was the lens through which all of life was meant to be seen. This is not about doctrine like heaven or hell. This is about the wiring of the human conscience. How children are taught to think about guilt, shame, purpose, and identity. The Jesuits didn't need to change commandments. They only needed to shift the weight of interpretation to adjust how sin felt, how the truth sounded. Even the concept of God slowly changed. from a cosmic force of mystery and love into a figure of quiet control, watching, guiding, rewarding those who followed the plan. And that plan was always wrapped in language that sounded good. But good can be a weapon when it's used to keep people small, silent, and afraid to step outside the lines. The shadow doctrine didn't erase Christianity, preserved its shell and filled it with something else, something more useful, something easier to manage, because the real truth is dangerous. It disrupts, questions. It is free. But a version of truth shaped by centuries of subtle rewrites can look holy and still hold chains. And that is how the Jesuits did what armies and kings could never do. They rewrote values, not with fire, but with understanding. Not by burning books, but by becoming their authors. And no one ever noticed the shift, because the words stayed the same. Only the meaning changed. Beneath the polished floors and candlelit chapels of Jesuit strongholds, there are rooms the public never sees, vaults locked with iron, sealed with symbols, guarded not by guards, but by silence. No one talks about them in sermons. No tour guide will take you there, but whispers have a way of slipping through even the thickest stone. They say the Jesuits hold more than scripture, that behind their libraries and lecture halls lie chambers filled with the forgotten and the forbidden, not just old books but ancient knowledge, devices, maps, artifacts that do not fit inside the timeline we were taught. Some believe these vaults protect the oldest copies of texts, long erased from the Bible. Gospels that speak of a different truth, writings that show a side of history the Church never wanted revealed. Not because they are false, but because they are too true. Other rumors speak of relics, not crosses or bones, but tools, instruments from ancient empires, things that hum with energy, that glow without wires. Technology that should not exist, that no one today can explain, and yet the Jesuits keep them sealed away. Why would priests need such things? Why guard them with such secrecy? Because power isn't always about armies or gold. Sometimes it's about what you know, and more importantly, what others are never allowed to know. The Society of Jesus was never just a religious order. It was an intelligence network, a memory bank, a vault for the lost knowledge of civilizations buried by time or erased on purpose. When empires fell, Jesuits arrived, not to conquer but to collect, to listen, to record, to take what might one day be useful. They walked through Incan temples, Chinese courts, African kingdoms, and took notes. Not always to share, often just to keep. And those notes turned into archives. Those archives became vaults, hidden, cataloged, buried. Some even claim they found star charts that predate Galileo, maps of the Earth from centuries before satellites, devices that calculate time with more precision than modern clocks, all tucked away behind doors. No outsider is allowed to open. Sounds like a legend, like fantasy. But ask yourself this. Why does the Vatican have a secret archive? Why do the Jesuits have their own locked collections hidden, even from the rest of the Church? Because there are things that do not belong in textbooks. Truths that would shift how we see ourselves, where we came from, what we are capable of. And the Jesuits, more than anyone else, understood the danger of a curious mind with access to the wrong book. So they built vaults, not to protect us, but to protect the story, to keep the narrative clean. And the world is safely blind, And if one day those vaults were opened, what would we see? Just scrolls and dust? Or the pieces of a history too powerful to be told? There is a silence in history that no one likes to touch. A place where faith and violence meet, where devotion turns into obedience, and obedience becomes something darker. This is where the Jesuits walk, not just as teachers or missionaries, but as enforcers of an invisible code. A creed whispered behind closed doors, a mission justified by heaven, but carried out in shadows. They never needed armies. They had a strategy. They had networks. And above all, they had the belief that what they were doing was not just allowed, but holy. That serving God meant protecting the church at any cost. The Jesuits took a special vow. Fourth vow. It was not about poverty or prayer. It was about obedience to the Pope, absolute and unquestioning. That vow gave them a license others did not have. And it was never about serving from the pulpit. It was about action behind the scenes. When threats rose against the church, they were not always answered with sermons. Some were answered with disappearances, with forged documents, with well-timed illnesses that no one could explain. The Jesuits were trained not just in theology, but in languages disguised memory, persuasion, and sometimes even chemistry. There were stories. A reformer who spoke too loudly dies in his sleep. A noble who defied the Vatican falls from a horse no one saw. A king shifts policy after confessing to a Jesuit advisor. Nothing is proven. Nothing is written, but the pattern is there. Always clean. Always quiet. They believed the ends justified the means. That to preserve the truth, sometimes you had to bury it. To protect the flock, sometimes you had to remove the wolf. And if that meant lies, poisons, or secrets, then so be it. Because the mission mattered more than the method. Some Jesuit writings even hinted at this mindset. A logic built on higher law. That telling the truth was not always required. That silence could be holy. That removing a threat could be seen as an act of mercy. Not murder. Mercy. This was not chaos. It was structured. It was cold, calculated, and always hidden beneath layers of respectability. A smiling priest, a wise teacher, a trusted confessor. And yet behind the robes may have stood someone trained in far more than scripture. This does not mean every Jesuit was an assassin. Most were scholars, missionaries, thinkers, but the order protected its own. And within its ranks, there was always room for those who would do what others could not. The Assassin's Creed was not written in blood. It was spoken in vows. It lived in the shadows. It was justified in Latin phrases and sealed with holy water. And it asked one question over and over again. If you truly believe this is God's work, how far would you go to protect it? For the Jesuits, the answer was simple. As far as it takes. It's easy to think of priests as peaceful, gentlemen who pray and teach and never question. But the Jesuits were never just priests. They were warriors in black robes, soldiers of the mind and soul. And at the heart of their power was a promise most people have never heard of. The fourth vow. To the outside world, Jesuits take the same vows as other orders. Poverty, chastity, obedience. But once fully trained and tested, certain Jesuits take one more, a final vow. The fourth vow. And this one changes everything. It is not a vow to God. Not directly. It is not a vow to the people or the church or the truth. It is a vow to the Pope. Personal. Total. unquestioning. The kind of vow you make with your whole life, not just with words. They promise to go anywhere, do anything, serve without hesitation, even if it means death, even if it means acting in silence where no one will ever thank them, even if it means doing things that look nothing like faith. That kind of obedience sounds holy, but look closer, because when a man gives up his will entirely to another man, it creates something dangerous. Not just loyalty but control. The Pope is called the Vicar of Christ, God's voice on earth. So to obey him without question is to treat his orders as divine. But popes are human. They change. They have alliances. They play politics. And when Jesuits follow without question, it means their missions are not always about faith. Sometimes they are about power. The fourth vow turned the Jesuits into tools, not passive ones. Intelligent, sharp, disciplined tools. The kind that could infiltrate a court, convert a king, or dissolve a heresy without ever drawing a sword. Who does this vow really serve? It serves the papacy, but not just the office. It serves whoever sits on the throne. Even if that throne is built on silence, manipulation, or fear. It gave the Jesuits access. It gave them protection. And in return, it asked for everything. No free will. No personal agenda. Just total execution of orders. Which means, if a mission required silence, they were silent. If it required a disappearance, they made it happen. If it required changing the story, they rewrote it. And the strange part? They didn't see this as evil. They saw it as a sacrifice. They believed they were protecting something bigger than themselves. Bigger than the church. Maybe even bigger than the truth. But the moment obedience becomes absolute, it stops being a virtue. It becomes a weapon. And whoever holds it controls more than men. They control history. The final vow wasn't about peace. It was about power, disguised as service. And once it was taken, there was no turning back. Because this wasn't a choice made once. It was a creed lived every day in silence, in the shadows, and the world never saw it coming. The story has always lived in the shadows. Whispers traded behind closed doors. Old books with missing pages. Names that vanish from records. And questions that no one in power ever seems to want answered. Were the Jesuits just priests in black robes or something more? Were they missionaries of mercy or hidden weapons for the Vatican? After everything we have explored, the truth may not be clear, but the pattern is. From the beginning, the Society of Jesus was never ordinary. Born in visions built like a military force, and sworn to a vow most people never hear about. A vow of obedience not to God alone, but to the Pope himself. Absolute, silent, final. That vow shaped everything that came next. A quiet army that answered to one voice, and operated in places where swords could not reach. They entered palaces as confessors, whispered in the ears of kings, traveled across oceans to convert and collect. And sometimes where they went people disappeared. Stories were rewritten. Whole cultures were changed. Not always by war. Sometimes just by a well-placed word. A forged document. Or a moment of silence when someone expected the truth. Are there proven assassinations linked to the Jesuits? That depends on who you ask and what you are allowed to read. The history books are clean, but the footnotes are messy. Reformers who died suddenly. Monarchs who changed course overnight. rivals of the Vatican who fell from grace for reasons that never quite added up. And behind many of those moments you find a Jesuit present but unnamed, quiet but influential, trusted but untouchable. Their training was never just about scripture. It was about memory, language, diplomacy, persuasion, and survival. In some cases, even chemistry. Why? Because they were not just teaching the gospel. They were navigating empires, playing games of power that most people never knew existed. Of course, not every Jesuit was an agent. Many were just scholars, scientists, and explorers. But that is what made the order so powerful. Its innocent face, its holy purpose, its loyal image, and behind that mask a network that could cross borders, bypass armies, and shape minds for generations. So is it myth or truth? Did the Jesuits carry daggers in the dark? Or did they simply think 10 steps ahead of everyone else? Maybe the real weapon was not steel but silence. Not poison but influence. Not murder but manipulation. And maybe that is what makes them so dangerous. Not because they left a trail of blood, but because they did not have to. They understood something deeper, that history is written not by those who kill, but by those who control what is remembered. So were the Jesuits the Vatican's hidden assassins? Maybe the better question is this. If they were, would we even be allowed to know? Thank you so much for watching. See y'all in the next one video. If you like my channel, like and subscribe.